Have you ever noticed that the harder you beg a narcissist to apologize, the less likely they are to do it? And then, the moment you stop chasing them, something strange happens. Suddenly, they reach out. Suddenly, they want to explain. Sometimes, they even say the words you've been waiting to hear. What if everything you've been taught about getting accountability from a narcissistic person is backwards? What if the very behaviors that seem reasonable, explaining your pain, presenting evidence, asking for understanding, are actually reducing the chances of receiving an apology? Stay with me, because by the end of this discussion, you'll understand why one simple shift changes the entire dynamic. More importantly, you'll understand why that shift has less to do with changing them and everything to do with changing your position in the relationship. Most narcissistic apologies are motivated by self-interest rather than empathy. And understanding this distinction can save people from years of confusion and disappointment. When most people apologize, they recognize that their actions caused pain, take responsibility for that impact, and feel genuine concern for the other person's emotional experience. The goal is repair. In narcissistic dynamics, however, an apology often serves a different purpose. It may be offered to restore a damaged image, prevent abandonment, regain access to admiration, stop criticism, or reestablish control over the relationship. The words may sound convincing, but the underlying motivation is frequently centered on what the narcissistic person stands to lose, rather than on the hurt they caused. This is why many people describe receiving apologies that initially feel validating, but quickly lose meaning. The apology may come after you withdraw, set boundaries, or become less available. It may include phrases like, "I'm sorry you feel that way," or "I only reacted because you pushed me too far," subtly shifting responsibility back onto you. Even when the words "I'm sorry" are spoken directly, they are not always accompanied by curiosity about your pain, willingness to answer difficult questions, or commitment to changing harmful behavior. Recognizing this pattern does not mean that every apology is automatically fake. Instead, it encourages people to look beyond emotional relief and examine consistency. Genuine accountability reveals itself through humility, respect for boundaries, and sustained behavioral change, rather than through carefully chosen words delivered at strategically convenient moments. Chasing, pleading, or demanding accountability often makes a narcissistic person more defensive because these approaches unintentionally activate the very mechanisms they use to protect themselves from shame and criticism. Most people assume that if they explain their feelings clearly enough, provide enough examples, or express how deeply they have been hurt, the other person will eventually understand and respond with empathy. In healthier relationships, this approach can lead to meaningful conversations and repair. In narcissistic dynamics, however, direct demands for accountability are frequently experienced as threats to self-image rather than invitations to connect. As a result, the discussion can quickly shift away from the original issue. Instead of addressing the hurtful behavior, they may argue over details, deny events ever happened, accuse you of exaggerating, question your memory, or insist that you are the real problem. The more intensely you pursue acknowledgement, the more energy becomes focused on winning the argument rather than understanding the impact of their actions. You may find yourself repeating the same points, defending your emotions, and desperately trying to prove that your pain is legitimate. This cycle can become exhausting because every attempt to obtain validation creates another opportunity for blame shifting and emotional manipulation. Over time, people often mistake persistence for progress, believing that one more conversation will finally lead to insight. Yet, repeated pleading can reinforce the unhealthy dynamic by communicating that you are willing to keep negotiating for basic respect. Recognizing this pattern is not about silencing yourself. It is about understanding that self-respect sometimes requires stepping out of debates that repeatedly invalidate your reality and drain your emotional resources. Boundaries create consequences that narcissists pay attention to because boundaries shift the focus from trying to change another person's behavior to deciding what you will and will not accept in your own life. Many people approach difficult relationships by repeatedly explaining their needs, hoping that understanding will naturally lead to change. When dealing with narcissistic patterns, however, words alone are often dismissed, minimized, or forgotten. A boundary becomes meaningful, not because it is announced, but because it is consistently upheld. For example, saying, "I won't continue conversations where I am being insulted," means ending the interaction when insults begin. Saying, "I need honesty in this relationship," means reconsidering your level of access and trust if deception continues. The consequence is not designed to punish, embarrass, or teach the other person a lesson. It is a protective action that preserves your emotional well-being and reinforces your self-respect. It communicates that continued access to your time, attention, and energy depends on mutual respect. Narcissistic individuals often pay closer attention when they encounter limits they cannot negotiate away. They may have become accustomed to others giving repeated chances, abandoning their own standards, or tolerating behaviors they initially said were unacceptable. When boundaries remain firm and predictable, the usual dynamic changes. They can no longer rely on guilt, charm, intimidation, or emotional exhaustion to restore the previous arrangement. This does not guarantee empathy, insight, or lasting transformation. What it does provide is clarity. It reveals how the other person responds when your needs matter as much as theirs, and whether they are willing to adapt when their actions carry real relational consequences. Emotional detachment removes the leverage a narcissistic person once had over you because it changes the way you respond to the dynamics that often keep the cycle going. Emotional detachment does not mean becoming cold, uncaring, or pretending that the relationship never mattered. It means learning to separate your sense of identity, worth, and stability from another person's approval, moods, or reactions. Instead of being pulled into every argument, accusation, or attempt to provoke an emotional response, you begin responding from a place of clarity rather than urgency. Narcissistic dynamics frequently depend on predictability. They may know which criticisms trigger your insecurities, which periods of silence make you anxious, or which promises keep you hopeful enough to overlook repeated disappointments. When your emotional state becomes heavily tied to their behavior, they hold significant influence over how you feel and how you act. You may find yourself constantly seeking reassurance, over-explaining your intentions, defending your character, or working harder to restore harmony after conflicts you did not create. Emotional detachment interrupts this pattern. You stop chasing explanations that never satisfy. Stop treating every emotional shift as an emergency, and stop viewing their approval as evidence of your value. You observe rather than immediately react. You listen to what they say, but place greater importance on what they consistently do. Their anger, withdrawal, charm, or temporary affection no longer automatically determines your next move. This shift can feel uncomfortable at first because many people mistake detachment for indifference or guilt themselves for no longer trying harder. In reality, it is an act of emotional self-protection that allows you to make decisions based on reality instead of fear, hope, or the exhausting desire to finally earn treatment that should never have required earning in the first place. At this point, if this conversation is helping you make sense of experiences you've struggled to understand, take a moment to engage with it, share your thoughts, reflect on what resonates with you, and continue exploring these patterns. The more we understand them, the less power confusion has over our decisions. Genuine apologies are rare and often incomplete in narcissistic relationships because true accountability requires qualities that directly challenge the defenses many narcissistic individuals rely on to protect their self-image. A sincere apology involves acknowledging harm without excessive justification, tolerating feelings of shame without becoming defensive, and making room for another person's pain without immediately redirecting attention back to oneself. For someone whose identity depends heavily on appearing right, admirable, or beyond criticism, these tasks can feel threatening and deeply uncomfortable. This is why many apologies in these dynamics come with conditions, explanations, or subtle attempts to preserve innocence. You may hear statements such as, "I'm sorry, but you misunderstood me. I only reacted because I was stressed," or "I apologized already, so why are you still upset?" While these responses may contain elements of regret, they often avoid full ownership of the behavior and its impact. The focus shifts toward ending the conflict quickly, reducing discomfort, or restoring the relationship to its previous state, rather than genuinely understanding the hurt that was caused. Even when an apology sounds heartfelt, it may still be incomplete. The person might acknowledge one aspect of their behavior while ignoring broader patterns. minimizing the extent of the damage, or becoming irritated when trust is not instantly restored. They may expect forgiveness to erase consequences without recognizing that rebuilding safety requires time and consistency.
Understanding that genuine apologies are both rare and often limited does not mean abandoning hope altogether. It means adjusting expectations and learning to evaluate accountability through actions rather than emotional relief. A meaningful apology is not simply expressed through words of regret. It is reflected in humility, patience, and a sustained commitment to behaving differently over time. Consistency matters more than confrontation because repeated actions reveal a person's true intentions far more accurately than emotional conversations, promises, or dramatic moments of insight. Many people believe that if they can just find the right words, present enough evidence, or finally get the narcissistic person to admit fault during a heated discussion, meaningful change will follow. This belief keeps them trapped in cycles of confrontation, hoping that one breakthrough conversation will transform the relationship. Unfortunately, insight expressed in a single moment means very little if it is not supported by consistent behavior afterward. A narcissistic person may occasionally appear remorseful, attentive, or eager to make things right, especially when faced with consequences or the possibility of losing something important to them. They may promise to communicate better, respect your boundaries, or stop engaging in behaviors that have repeatedly caused harm. In those moments, it is natural to feel hopeful. After all, everyone wants to believe that acknowledgement will lead to change. However, isolated gestures cannot erase long-standing patterns. Consistency asks different questions. Do they continue respecting your boundaries when it no longer benefits them to do so? Do they take responsibility without becoming defensive each time an issue arises? Do they follow through on commitments even when nobody is watching or praising them? Are their efforts sustained for weeks and months rather than days? Confrontation often creates temporary emotional intensity, but consistency reveals character. Real change is usually quiet, repetitive, and reliable. It shows up in daily choices, predictable respect, and a willingness to practice healthier behaviors repeatedly. Trust is not rebuilt through powerful speeches or emotional breakthroughs. It is rebuilt through small acts of accountability that occur often enough to become a new pattern rather than an exception. Observing behavior change is more important than listening to words, because words can be shaped by emotion, pressure, or strategy, while behavior reveals what someone is actually willing to do when no one is forcing them to change. In relationships involving narcissistic patterns, spoken apologies, promises, or emotional declarations can feel powerful in the moment, but they often lack durability if they are not backed by consistent actions over time. This is why focusing only on what is said can create repeated cycles of hope and disappointment. A person may express deep regret after a conflict, insist they understand your pain, or promise that things will be different. In emotionally intense moments, these statements can sound convincing, and may temporarily restore a sense of connection. However, the real test begins after the emotional pressure fades. Do they continue to show respect when they are not trying to repair damage? Do they avoid repeating the same harmful patterns when there is no immediate consequence? Do they change how they treat you in everyday situations, not just during crises? Behavior change is measured through repetition, not intention. 1 or 2 positive actions do not outweigh a long-standing pattern of inconsistency. For example, someone might act caring immediately after a confrontation, but return to dismissive or controlling behavior once things calm down. This creates confusion because it blends moments of apparent growth with ongoing instability. When you prioritize behavior over words, you begin to see relationships more clearly. You stop being guided by emotional peaks and start recognizing patterns that persist over time. This clarity helps reduce confusion and prevents you from mistaking temporary remorse for genuine transformation. Ultimately, behavior is the most reliable indicator of whether change is real or simply being performed in the moment. Your goal should not be extracting an apology, but protecting your well-being, because the pursuit of an apology can quietly shift from a desire for understanding into a loop that keeps you emotionally tied to someone who may not be capable of offering the kind of accountability you are seeking. Many people enter these dynamics believing that closure will come once the other person finally admits wrongdoing, expresses remorse, or acknowledges the harm they caused. On the surface, that seems reasonable. In reality, it often becomes a moving target that keeps emotional energy invested in someone else's readiness to change rather than your own ability to heal. When the focus remains on getting an apology, your attention stays locked on their reactions, timing, and emotional state. You begin monitoring every interaction for signs of regret or acknowledgement. This can lead to overthinking, re-engagement after periods of distance, or reopening conversations that repeatedly end in frustration. Even when an apology does occur, it may not bring the relief you expected, especially if it is followed by repeated patterns of the same behavior. Protecting your well-being shifts the center of gravity back to you. It means prioritizing clarity over uncertainty, consistency over hope, and emotional stability over temporary reassurance. Instead of asking whether they finally understand, the more important question becomes whether your environment is becoming healthier through continued interaction with them. This shift allows you to make decisions based on impact rather than intention. Over time, this approach reduces emotional dependency on validation from someone else and strengthens your internal sense of worth. It helps you recognize that peace does not require permission, explanation, or agreement from the person who caused the disruption. Your healing becomes less about receiving closure from them and more about creating it for yourself
through boundaries, distance, and self-respect. What ultimately becomes clear in all of this is that the real power in these dynamics was never sitting in the apology you were waiting for. It was sitting in how long you stayed available to patterns that kept repeating themselves. When you stop centering your peace around whether someone finally admits what they did, you begin to see the relationship for what it actually is, not what you hoped it could become.
An apology can feel like closure, but closure that depends on another person's readiness is never truly stable. What brings real clarity is not the moment they say the right words, but the moment you no longer